Okay, in this presentation, we're going to take a look at kind of the history of and the theories behind science fiction and horror genres, though mainly we're going to be funneling down and looking at horror. So hopefully you got a chance to read the chapter for this week, which outlines a lot of these things. Again, my hope here is to take these things a little bit deeper, especially in our look at the horror genre. So as the text points out, science fiction and horror are actually quite close to each other. And in fact, they kind of come of age around the same time. Science fiction certainly arises as a distinct genre on the heels of World War II, the atomic bomb, the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union especially. And horror maybe arises a little bit before that, but they both seem to reflect and explore similar kinds of anxieties and similar questions. Kind of the central question of the humanities. What does it mean to be human? Science fiction and horror explore this question in different, but also in overlapping ways. There are many science fiction films that I think you could also label as horror films, and so we'll try to tease out some of those boundaries as we go along here, but also recognize that this is in some ways you're kind of boxing at shadows with this kind of stuff when you try to draw lines around them. So we'll do the best we can. So the textbook I thought had this really interesting kind of dichotomy that science fiction looks for change. It's born out of kind of intellectual exploration and asks the question, what if this happened? And the results can either be kind of glorious or horrific too. Horror often responds to change with an oh no, this monster appears. Something has been upended in the quiet daily domestic life of the people in the film, and now we react with terror to it before we try to get our wits together to try to stop it or change it. But they're both covering similar kinds of ground with the kinds of responses they have to the problems, to the monsters, to the challenges in the respective films. So the textbook points out a number of films that kind of fall under this dual category. I think a film like Alien came out in 1979. Again, if you're a fan of science fiction and or horror, this is a great one. Sigourney Weaver. It's one of those that I think really kind of treads that line between science fiction. I mean, the title of the film is Alien, after all. But the alien, as it reveals itself, is a horrific, kind of soul-destroying, human-destroying kind of monster. And this goes way back to kind of this idea that the atomic world that we live in after the bombing of Japan in 1945. What kind of horrors could this unleash? It's a well-known fact that things like the Godzilla films that come out of Japan post-war reflect kind of anxieties about a kind of a radioactive post a nuclear kind of world. Here's the thing from another world. Here we have again science fiction as horror. I want to show you this. This is arguably the most famous clip from the Alien movie, and I think illustrates a lot of these things I was just talking about. What happened to this guy? The first thing that I'm going to do when I get back is to get some decent food. Then I taste better.
You pound down stuff like this.
I read them.
Right now.
You know what it's made of.
I don't want to talk about what it's made of. I mean, the food they eat. Eat your
So you get the idea there. This famous kind of gross out scene. But I mean, in some ways, it's kind of a classic horror movie setup. You don't get any more domestic than people just hanging around a dinner table having food together, and then it's upended. It's interrupted by the alien, the monster, making its presence out of the body of this poor guy whose body's literally been infiltrated by the monster. The text also talks about kind of the search for knowledge as an aspect of both science fiction and horror. So as we were saying, science fiction, a lot of those stories are born out of intellectual curiosity, as the famous Star Trek phrase was, to boldly go where no one has gone before. It's it's the endeavor of the human spirit to see what's beyond the next frontier, what's over the next mountain, around the next corner, and that's where again wonder and fantasy and horror can exist in that unknown. I mean, so much of the dramatic edge of these kinds of stories, both science fiction and horror, come from the unknown. Where does this monster come from? Where are we going? Can we get back? All that kind of stuff. So a science fiction story will often demand a journey, trying to solve an intellectual question or sake an intellectual thirst. Horror, too, maybe less so. Horror is more kind of a responsive, a reactive genre. And the intellectual curiosity comes maybe later in the film. Can we understand where did the monster come from? If by understanding its origins, can we come to some understanding of how to defeat it? It's a similar kind of intellectual curiosity, although it's maybe packaged and directed in different kinds of ways. Our textbook talks a lot about kind of how both science fiction and horror deal with this encounter between the self and the other. How do we deal with the alien? How do we deal with the monster? And so often, I think one of the things that makes these stories fascinating and what draws us to them is that the monster, the alien, is like ourselves enough that we see something of ourselves in it, but it's also different enough that it's also terrifying. It's also frightening. It's that edge of human and non-human. So lots of films, particularly science fiction, will kind of express an anxiety about where is the human race going, particularly kind of in terms of technology. In the real world, we might say, in a kind of an Enlightenment, scientifically based society, I think many people have this idea that technology will save us. The next invention. Right now, of course, we're in the midst of this COVID pandemic, and lots of people are hoping for a vaccine. Right, an effective vaccine is going to dig us out of this hole. Technology will save us. New kinds of energy production will solve the climate change problem. That's a very kind of common, particularly kind of Western way of looking at the world. And science fiction, and I think horror to some degree too, will often express an anxiety about that. This idea that, okay, yes, technology promises to save us, and that if used well, if designed right, it's a good thing. But there's this anxiety about, well, what happens? To kind of put it cartoonishly, what happens when the robots take over? What happens if we create a technology that we can no longer manage, that we can no longer control? I mean, that's the foundation of so many kind of science fiction stories. So a few famous ones. The Matrix. This idea that we've already been duped. We're already being controlled, used as batteries. Human beings themselves are being used as energy sources by this alien race, and we're oblivious to it. We live in kind of this strange netherworld of the Matrix, not even aware what's happening to us. Or before that, Space Odyssey 2001 posits the computer HAL, who takes over the spaceship, because gains a kind of supra machine awareness and takes over and develops a control that the humans can no longer control. Or Terminator 2, this idea that one day the robots do take over, And it's only through time travel that maybe humans have a shred of possibility of averting this disaster that waits for them, this apocalyptic disaster that awaits for them on the horizon. Now, we've used this word liminal in this class before. We were talking about the Western film, about how the cowboy hero figure or anti-hero figure is often a liminal figure. And in that sense, we used it more in terms of liminal spaces, that the cowboy hero is heroic, but he's also tragic in that he can navigate this distance between nature and civilization, the savage and the non-savage. He brings civilization, but he often does it at the point of a gun. So he can traverse these spaces between the savage and the civilized, but he doesn't belong in either. So we've used that word liminal before. The word itself just means kind of in between. Now, in science fiction and especially horror, you have liminal figures in a much more kind of literal kind of way. Monsters, aliens too, like we were just saying, is that one of the things that makes them fascinating but also terrifying is that they're like us but they're not like us, and they're kind of they dwell in that kind of slippery boundary between the human and the non-human, and that's what many people would argue makes them horrifying, to a point where you can't quite put your finger on it, but we recognize something unsettling about that. So if you think about liminal characters from throughout the centuries of storytelling, even going back to like Greek mythology, the centaur, and a dangerous, wild creature of kind of pure nature, part human, part horse. So many creatures from mythologies around the world, like a Medusa, like a Cyclops. They are human enough that we recognize something of ourselves in them, but they are different enough that we're horrified and we're repelled by them. Other things in science fiction, the android is often a figure of fascination. It kind of speaks to kind of our robot future. But there's also something unsettling. An android is meant to kind of mimic and be as close to human as possible, but there's something off about it that can also be horrific. An alien, too, will look different. Often in its depictions, it'll be obviously non-human. This kind of classic, almost guitar pick-shaped head, the wide, glassy eyes. But you also see 5 fingers on a hand, an opposable thumb. And so it's close enough to human beings that we recognize ourselves in the general shape, but it's other enough that it's scary. We'll talk a minute about the classic horror films, but some of the classic movie monsters fall right into this category. A vampire is at a glance looks human, but is undead. There's something off and horrible about this figure. A zombie. The whole slew of zombie shows, Walking Dead, World War Z, that have come out fairly recently, I think exploit that kind of notion that the zombie is horrific because they once were human and are no longer human. It can express a kind of an anxiety perhaps about kind of where is humanity going at its most kind of on a more academic level. The werewolf too, the human being that under the light of a full moon will transform into another creature and then transform back to crossing that slippage between human and animal. Even things like a ventriloquist doll or a clown are kind of classic. They become kind of classic modern horror movie monsters, in the idea that I think there's also kind of this element that something that's innocent, something that is a doll, almost a toy, that should be used for making people laugh, is unsettling enough and close enough to human, but distinct enough from human that it's inherently unsettling. So much has been made about kind of the whole clowns are creepy aspect. Here we have Pennywise from the latest iteration of Stephen King's It. This again, the same thing with the ventriloquist doll. The idea is that clowns are supposed to make kids laugh. They're supposed to be funny. They're supposed to be figures of joy. But the fact that they are masked and full of makeup and the way that they dress, it's different enough from humans that there's something off about the clown. And horror movies have exploited that kind of subtle difference to great effect. I want to show you this short horror film. It's about 6 minutes long. I'll let it play. Again, kind of a disclaimer: if this isn't your thing, you can just kind of fast forward and go past this. I don't think it's all that terrifying. I think it does a nice job of building suspense. But I want to play this and then just make a few comments about it, kind of how it expresses some of these kind of classic horror movie tropes and themes. This is a short horror film called The Tall Man. So we get a nice little jump scare there at the end. So I thought nice. I thought it's kind of a nice, effective piece in just over 5 minutes there. But you notice that a lot of the suspense is, of course, built by what we don't see. Kind of the Hitchcock theory of horror. It's the unknown that is always more terrifying than what you show. And we only get a kind of a glimpse of the monster, whatever it is, and we have whatever is going to happen next. Just a tiny jump there at the end, but it plays into kind of a very common horror movie trope of the domestic sphere, right? This young woman, apparently single, alone in her apartment, that should be her castle, that should be her safe place to be and exist, and we have this strange creature kind of infiltrating that safe space, and that kind of upending of the domestic sphere is such a common element in horror films. The deep-rooted anxiety about having kind of the one place where you're supposed to feel safe becomes a threat, as it were. And so, yeah, and then the glimpse of the tall man there at the end, I think, plays into that kind of that liminal stuff that we were just talking about, right? He's human enough that we recognize it, but he's other enough that he's horrifying there at the end, and horrifying enough that we imagine dark things beyond the end of this short little film. All right, a little bit about kind of the history of the horror genre. Many film critics will point to, just like we were talking with noir, that German Expressionism, the way it looked, the way it felt, kind of the style of it, the feel of it, had a huge influence not only in noir but also on the horror genre too. I want to show you just a trailer from this very early film, Nosferatu, which many people will point to and call as one of the very first horror films ever to be made. Not an American film, a German film. But I think you'll even see this little still here. I just realized this kind of the shadow of the creature in this movie. I think is when you in The Tall Man, where we just see kind of his outline, just see his shadow. I think it's meant to look exactly like this. It's kind of a nice little nod towards this exact frame from this classic horror film. It's got to be. I don't know for sure because it just struck me just now, but that wouldn't surprise me. It's kind of a nice little illusion. So have a look at this trailer, and I think you'll see what I'm talking about. Oh, the video's unavailable. Okay, well, that's okay. It's full. I mean, just like we saw with noir, it's full of that, dark and light, shadow and light, lots of shadows, elongated shadows, the building of suspense through music and an image, no dialogue necessary, right? In 1922, of course, films didn't have sound yet, so you had to do what you had to do. And even the short film we just watched, The Tall Man, right? Done completely without dialogue. It just suspense built by the situation, by imagery, by camera angle, and by the music. But in kind of the classic horror film as it developed, and kind of came over from Europe, we might argue, to America. The first kind of classic horror movie monsters were what kind of our textbook calls these external monsters, these liminal kinds of creatures. The vampire, Count Dracula, played famous by Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff's kind of classic depiction of Frankenstein's monster. This is Karloff again as the Mummy, and all these figures too. Again, they're human enough that we recognize them, but they are other enough that they are dangerous. The undead vampire, Frankenstein is what we would call a golem, a kind of creature that's made from other parts of human beings, so he's human but not human. The Mummy, again, an undead creature that's supposed to remain dead, is now kind of horrifyingly come back to life. Now, many people point to Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which again, as we've talked a bit about in this class when we were talking about Hitchcock, as kind of the first modern horror film, if not kind of the first slasher film. There's with actual slashing going on, and the big shift in Psycho that film critics will point to is that the monster is not some kind of undead creature. It's not some kind of demon. It's the monster is, as I have up here, the monster is us. It's Norman Bates. He's kind of gone off his rocker. He's damaged. He's lost something. And he's become this kind of other figure. He's become his mother, as well as himself. Again, he's liminal in that sense that his identity is slippery. But to shift the monster in the horror film from the external to some kind of almost a comic book cliched kind of monster to us is a huge psychological transition. And this is not to say, of course, that after Psycho there weren't, kind of classic monster movies that still make them. But that psychological shift to the idea that we have this darkness in ourselves that can be, any of us can become the monster, is a new level of horror. All right, I want to end here with, I have kind of 8 theories of horror that I want to share with you. And I don't offer any of these as any kind of be-all, end-all to kind of understanding horror. But I would say probably more than any other genre that we're looking at in this class, horror has had the most ink spilled trying to understand it. Where does it come from? How does it work? And why do we watch these things, right? This idea of, is that indicative of kind of a sickness of our society that so many people are drawn to these kinds of stories? Or is there a positive benefit that comes from these things? So there's all kinds of questions and theories that have developed on kind of, how does horror work? Why does it work? Why is it a genre in the first place? And so I want to offer some of these, again, like I said, not as an answer to the question. I think in some ways, I'm hesitant to do this. It's kind of like explaining a joke, right? The minute you have to explain a joke, it's not funny anymore. And I think one of the fascinating things about horror, kind of effective horror, is that you can't explain it. And that's what makes it horrifying, right? So it's this idea that you can't quite put your finger on kind of what makes the horrific. And that's what kind of gives it its power. But nonetheless, film critics are going to critic. And psychologists are going to psychologize. And so I think it's worth, just as a thought experiment, of walking through some of these. One of my favorites is Sigmund Freud's theory. Not that, Freud, he lived and died long before the horror film, but he developed kind of this theory of what he called in German, the Unheimlich, we translate it as the uncanny. And he talked about kind of the uncanny double, or kind of the story of the doppelganger, if you've heard of that. This idea that we all have kind of this mysterious double other that's out there in the universe that represents kind of a darker half to ourselves. And horror critics have jumped on this kind of idea of the uncanny and seeing it kind of showing up in lots of film. Here we see kind of the creepy twin girls from The Shining, and how horror movies have often made use of that uncanny double. I think this also plays into this idea of kind of the liminal. The monsters that are the scariest are the ones that we can see ourselves the most in. And so the uncanny double, it looks like us enough to that we recognize it, but it's also repulsive, because we see that there's something there that we don't want, that we want to push away. So, in Freud's psychological theories, these are the kind of things that are embedded within us that we have to work out, that we have to deal with, that we have to expunge. And maybe the horror films do something like that on some kind of subconscious level, perhaps. Now, to go back way to the beginnings of kind of Western civilization and its literature, the Greek writer, philosopher, polymath Aristotle. Of course, they didn't have horror films in ancient Greece, but what they did have was tragedy, and lots of Greek tragedies share a lot in common with horror films. Lots of dark, horrible things happening on the stage, and murders and suicides and rapes and all of these kinds of things. Most Greek tragedies that survive are filled with death and murder and awful, awful things. And Aristotle lived in the century that kind of after the heyday of Greek tragedy. But he was the first guy that we know of that really sat down and asked the question, why are we going to the theaters and watching these kinds of stories? So with the famous story of Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king, this is a story about a man who unwittingly kills his own father and marries his own mother and has children with his own mother, and ends up gouging his own eyes out when he realizes what he's done. Aristotle kind of asked the question, one of many questions he asked was, why are we watching these? What does an audience get out of that? And he developed this theory that many people still, I think it's shared by many, I would say, psychologists and psychiatrists today. This idea of catharsis, kind of a purging, a purification is what that word literally means, is that Aristotle says that when we watch these characters on the stage, we identify with them. Even if we're horrified by them, we identify with them. And in particular, they raise the emotions of pity. We feel bad for these characters, and fear. Again, maybe there's the horror there. So maybe in a horror film, we pity the poor characters who are being pursued by the monster, and we're terrified by the monster ourselves. And Aristotle was of the kind of opinion that by doing this, we kind of deal with these darker sides of ourselves. We plumb the depths and the darkness of our emotions, this kind of stuff that we don't want to admit resides in our hearts and in our souls. And through literature, through narrative, through performance, through theater, through film, you can deal with these things and you purge them. And so that these kinds of stories can have a kind of a cleansing effect on the human spirit. And so Aristotle said, the best tragedies, not all tragedies, not all horror films do this well. But I think if Aristotle were alive today, he would say a good horror film can have the effect of of purifying the viewer. And so you deal with this darkness on the screen, in the safe environment of the movie theater, or in your living room, on your TV, and then you can walk away cleansed to some degree. Make of it what you will. I think it's an attractive theory. Other ones that have kind of distinct academic-y names. Excitation transfer theory. This idea that horror films raise up negative feelings, which then, by contrast, heighten positive feelings when, say, the monster is killed, the girl survives, the whole trope of the final girl, or simply the viewer survives watching the film. I would say this is fairly close to kind of Aristotle's theory. This is that, horror films raise up fear. Who likes to experience fear? I guess maybe some of us do in kind of a backwards kind of way. But this idea that horror films heighten our sensation. And if you heighten negative feelings, then anything that you feel on the other side of that is also going to be heightened. And so when the monster is finally killed, although we know in many horror films that's often a false ending, or the one girl survives and we're relieved at her survival, or this one that I like is that kind of by watching a film and facing the fear and keeping your eyes open for the most part, you survive the film. And that's kind of a journey in and of itself. And so by heightening those emotions of negativity when you watch the film, the heightened positive feelings when the film is over have a kind of cleansing, uplifting effect. Number 4, curiosity-driven pleasure. This is kind of in line with kind of the search for knowledge, that horror is a search for knowledge. I found this quote from author Noel Carroll, who wrote an essay called Why Horror? Very interested in this question. He wrote, all narratives might be thought to involve the desire to know. However, the horror fiction is a special variation on this general narrative motivation because it has at the center of it something which is given as, in principle, unknowable. So the horror movie has a hook that often will have a hook, Carol would say, is that you go into a horror film, watching a horror film, knowing that you're probably not going to get the answer. The pleasure comes in being surprised by what happens, by accepting the fact that you're never going to fully know, usually, I would say, where the monster comes from. Can the monster be defeated? But the curiosity about it and the surprises about it throughout give a kind of satisfaction. And so it's a kind of an accomplishment for viewing the film and having your curiosity satisfied, if not, or maybe just simply piqued by what's happening. Number 5, this is kind of interesting, gender socialization theory. I cite just kind of one experiment among many that have done along these lines. Also in a kind of source I found. A 1986 psychological experiment showed the same horror movie to 36 male and 36 female undergraduates, so a group of people kind of roughly your own age. And the results showed that young men said that they enjoyed the film more when the young women that they were with were distressed. So when the young women were scared, the men they liked the film more. And young women enjoyed the film mostly when their male companions were less frightened. And so some have thought that kind of horror films are designed maybe explicitly or kind of inadvertently to kind of underline the kind of the status quo. This kind of the conservative idea that one of the roles of men is to protect women, and one of the things that women look to men is for protection, and that the way these young men and women react to the horror film kind of acted out kind of that socialization of kind of how men and women, quote unquote, are supposed to react and to react towards each other. Number 6, horror as reflective or amplification of societal fears. We talked about that, with science fiction talking about dystopian, post-human, post-dystopians, anxiety about where kind of technology is taking us. Horror does that too. The textbook talked about the Invasion of the Body Snatchers movie. That was one that came out in the 1950s. It was redone, I believe, in the 1970s, and at least the first one was largely thought to be kind of reflective of American anxiety about communism. The communists are infiltrating our government, they're infiltrating our societies, our schools, and we don't know about it. There's spies everywhere. And so our bodies, quote unquote, are being snatched by the communists. And so you have the kind of this horror / kind of alien film that kind of plays out this kind of anxiety, kind of the Red Scare, as it were. This one is called, I don't read Korean. I can't remember. But it's the book talks about it, or a film like it, where Korea was going through kind of a rash of suicides by young girls, and the society was very, reasonably horrified by this and eager to get to the bottom of it. And so there were a number of films that came up that kind of amplified those fears, that showed, many young women in suicide pacts and killing themselves for mysterious reasons. And so it's kind of an amplification of the societal fear. It's a way of kind of throwing it in the face of the culture and kind of saying, we have to deal with this by giving an exaggerated version of that particular story. Number 7, this is kind of a famous one. Horror is kind of integrative or conservative. I don't know if you've seen the film Scream. Came out in 1996. And it was famous at the time. There are other films that have done this kind of thing now since then, but it was very innovative at the time in that it was a horror movie about horror movies. And Kevin Williamson, who wrote that film, he kind of recognized, he wasn't the first to recognize it, but he put it into a film narrative of that horror movies seem to have rules about them. There's a kind of morality about horror films. Again, not all horror films, but many of them kind of follow this idea, as kind of put bluntly here, that in a horror film, if you want to survive, you can never have sex, you can never drink or do drugs, and you can never say, I'll be right back, because you won't be back. And there are characters in that film Scream that kind of, basically say these things in a peer setting. And then the film plays out, and a lot of these things, as they're stated, come true. And so this idea, I think this is kind of a facet of the whole kind of gender socialization piece. And this idea that a horror movie can be about a monster running amok, and everything seems to be chaotic and topsy-turvy. But at the end of the day, there's kind of a conservative morality that the films preach, for lack of a better word. And so it's the girls especially who have sex, guys too, but again, it's feminine sexuality is more punishable in these movies than male sexuality. Are killed, doing drinking too much, doing drugs, this kind of thing will put you on the radar of the monster. And it's the people who don't do these things that remain pure, so to speak, that will often survive the film. And I think there's a lot of truth to this. I mean, enough of these kinds of things have gone on in horror films that they become a trope. The only reason I think one of the reasons that the film Scream was so successful is people saw this and said, yeah, that's really, really true. That's throughout the whole history of horror movies. And number 8. Kind of bookend these with kind of these famous, early psychiatrists of Sigmund Freud and now Carl Jung, who we talked about with the kind of in the hero's journey and kind of his idea of these archetypes, and that myths and legends are populated with these particular kinds of character types. The mentor, the hero, the witch, the child, and the like. Another one of these that Jung talks about. Again, Jung lived really before the era of the horror movie, but he talks about the archetype of the shadow or the shadow self. And again, I think this is in line with lots of what we've already talked about. I think this is very close to Freud's uncanny, just more on a kind of perhaps an interior level than on the external kind of visual level. So I have this quote here from Jung about this archetype. It is a frightening thought that man also has a shadow side to him, consisting not just of little weaknesses and foibles, but of a positively demonic dynamism. So this is kind of Psycho, this idea that the monster is potentially in all of us. This is Freud's uncanny double, that there's a shadow self of us out there. And so maybe these monsters, as they appear on horror films, are kind of manifestations of that shadow self. All right, now, as I have on the Blackboard page, I'm going to offer simply as extra credit, since we won't be meeting together this week. If you want to watch the Halloween film on your own, it'll cost you a few bucks to find it on iTunes or Amazon or whatever. But if you want to watch it and then attend to these questions on the Blackboard page, I'll give you some. I'll be generous with some extra credit points. Again, like I said in class last week, if horror's not your thing, that's fine. Stay away from it. I know that it's a more kind of triggering genre than probably any other that we're watching or considering together in class. But if you're into it, if you want to, you'll find these same questions on the course Blackboard site and turn in a forum, and I'll make sure it gets to your grade where it helps you the best. All right, thanks for paying attention, and hopefully I'll see you in class soon.